may also be gaining reputation. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm. At the moment, there seem to be 23 attendees.
So, as long as it's like not a huge number, I'm also happy for people just to unmute themselves and ask the question. If that raising hand is not, that's not
we need them to raise their hand because
because you're running it as a webinar. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, we're just a bit concerned about Zoom bombing, so we've locked everything down.
Got it.
Okay, that sounds good though. So we're up to 30.
We're up to 30 to 27 attendees at the moment.
Yeah, so the more interaction is better. This just the Q&A, it seems to be not that the questions that are entered in Q&A are generally best handled at the end. So that's
okay. So we've come up to the hour. Are we about to begin?
Yes.
Let me know when we start, when we go live.
I think we're already live on YouTube. And when Daron comes back, maybe you introduce Daron and we take it from there.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. And it's also a pleasure to introduce Daron Acemoglu. I expect you all know his work. He's one of the leading economists of our time, winner of the John Bates Clark Medal, the Nemers Prize, the BBVA Prize, and many other recognitions of his work. Daron, I will turn things over to you. But let me just say that if you are an attendee and would like to ask a question during Daron's talk, please raise your electronic hand and we will recognize you and unmute you. There will also be a question period at the end, and if you're not an official attendee, please write something in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will try to accommodate you at the end of the talk. Daron, please take it over.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. It's an honor to be invited to this new online seminar series, and it's an honor to have Eric chair this session. I wish it had been a happier occasion rather than a series that's triggered by a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's on the one hand, it's hard to believe that something like this is happening in the 21st century. On the other hand, if you have looked at history, it's not surprising that things like this keep on happening. But we still try to be optimistic and hopeful. And my thoughts, as the thoughts of many of the organizers I know, are with the people of Ukraine in this very dark hour. But on to less dark subjects, or hopefully less dark subjects. So I'm going to talk about a joint work with Alex He and Daniel Maire. Alex is at the University of Maryland and Daniel is at the University of Copenhagen. Eclipse of rent sharing, the effects of managers' business education on wages and labor share in the US and Denmark. So what is this paper about? It's an empirical paper, and it has a very specific topic, which I'm going to introduce. But it is actually also part of a research direction that I have been grappling with for quite a while, which is about perhaps you can call it as non-standard factors that influence distribution and inequality. So as of course many of you know, there has been major changes in the distribution of income in advanced economies, huge increase in inequality, slowdown of wage growth, changes in the labor share. For instance, for the two countries that I'm going to talk about, the labor share declined by about 5 percentage points in the US and almost 5 percentage points in Denmark over the course of about less than 20 years. In US manufacturing, the decline has been actually more staggering, almost 25 percentage points. Median real wage growth that used to be above 2% per year in the US went down to essentially a crawl, 0.3% per year. And then, of course, a lot of this slowdown in wages, in fact, reversal in wage growth has fallen on the shoulders of lower skilled workers. The focus in the economics literature in this context has been on fairly standard economic factors, although broadening over time, international trade, for example, skill bias, technological change. More recently, some of my work has focused on automation, which sort of is a departure from the more standard ways of thinking about technology, but is still sort of in the context of technology changing the marginal product of different types of workers and impacting average wages and inequality through that channel. Tax policy deregulation, but also people have recognized that things such as minimum wage, decline in unionization, threat of offshoring via non-competitive labor markets, bargaining, etc., may have been a part of the story as well. What has been generally left out of this discussion are sort of less standard economic factors. So some people have mentioned, for instance, changing norms may be part of the story, but quantifying them or actually bolstering the case that they are important has not been easy. Related to norms, something else that's actually quite important is that if we are in an economy where everything is not a la Arrow de Breu first welfare theorem, some players are going to be particularly powerful because they have the ability to set wages, prices, or other aspects of the nature of work. And their views, vision, values, beliefs may have particularly important effects. So in the context of modern economies, CEOs are, of course, among the most powerful agents. Again, in a competitive market, what you think as a CEO may not matter because everything is so fluid that there is no ability to set prices or wages, or there is a unique profit maximizing strategy that you're going to be forced to adopt by competition in the market for control. But I think many people would recognize that these are not quite realistic assumptions. The question is how far from realism they are. And the proof of the pudding there is actually to show that some of these sort of factors might actually be powerfully important in understanding changes in distribution, wages, inequality, etc. So in this context, what Alex, Daniel, and I do is look at a specific type of influence on CEOs, which is whether they have been educated in business schools, which is, of course, a package. It comes with networks for certain values and beliefs, certain sort of curricula that you are exposed to. And we're going to try to estimate the causal effect of going to a business school, but as a way of understanding this broader set of issues about what are the priorities and values of business managers. Business education has gained a lot of popularity over time, both in the US and Denmark and many other countries. We focus on US and Denmark, both for data reasons. We have great data in both cases, but also looking at it from the point of view of two very different institutional setups is actually quite interesting for reasons I will get into as I go along.
Daron, I see a hand raised.
Please, yes, go ahead.
It's Akbarov. You have your hand raised. Can Akbarov be unmuted? Please go ahead. Ask your question, Akbarov.
I think he went off.
Oh, all right. Sorry.
Yeah,
that's okay. So business education has gained popularity in both countries. For example, in the US, about 25% of CEOs had a business MBA education. That has increased to almost 45% for over 43%. Similar increases from a lower base in Denmark. So that's one aspect that could be interesting. Now, it's not for sure. There is some debate on this in some sociology and business education journals, but management practices and values that are taught in business schools might be quite important. Two sets of these are quite salient there has been, over the last 3 decades especially, a lot of emphasis on shareholder value maximization, either in the formal form, that's what we teach in many of the finance courses and some of the economics courses, and also through the sort of the Friedman doctrine that the business of business is to maximize shareholder value. There has been a lot of emphasis on things that, at least in the Sloan School here at MIT, used to be called re-engineering the corporation. Sometimes they go under different names, which is creating lean corporation by cutting unnecessary costs, for example, by better use of software. So the question is whether these ideas popularized by business schools have a meaningful impact on inequality. But this is what I'm going to talk about. So what we do is specifically, we're going to estimate what I'm going to call the causal effect of a manager CEO or top manager CEO with a business school education, and then explore the mechanisms via which this matters. We're going to try to get to this causality from 2 angles. First, try to show that this is in fact the impact of somebody with an MBA education. And then secondly, try to show that this is not selection of individuals with different characteristics into business schools. So it's really the effects of somebody who's exposed to business school ideas, ideology, that is really driving this. Since time is short, let me give a very high-level summary of the results. That way I will actually be able to go into the details. But if there are some questions, I can spend more time on giving a preview as well. We're going to find that business education does not make managers more productive. Business-educated managers don't have greater sales, employment, investments, or exports in an event study sense. But in both Denmark and the US, the appointment of a business manager leads to a significant decline in average wages and the labor share. For example, in the US, after the appointment of a business manager, average wages are lower by about 7 percentage points, 6.6, 6.7 percentage points, percent in 5 years. And the labor share also falls quite significantly. The numbers in Denmark are similar, a little smaller. Business managers themselves and shareholders gain, but obviously workers are not. I'll explain what other changes are going on within these firms and worry about various confounding effects in a second. And a lot of the paper is going to be about exploring the mechanism via which this happens, and I'll talk about that. So let me skip the rest of the summary of the results and the literature. I'll come back to the literature at the end. So let me give you the plan of the paper. I'll talk a little bit about data and descriptive statistics, empirical strategies. I'll spend a little bit of time on endogeneity concerns, confounding factors, because I'm sure that's in the minds of many people. And then I'll present the event study estimates, talk briefly about robustness, additional results. So I'll zero in on how this rent sharing changes are happening. And then I'll worry about selection versus causal effects using a different strategy and augmented data set. And then I'll conclude with discussions and implications. If there are any questions, this is a good time to ask. Let me pause for a second.
There's a hand raised,
Okay.
Sandro Salerno. Please unmute Sandro.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. I have a question. Since the hypothesis at the beginning was that these results were driven by this ideology of shareholder maximization, shareholders value maximization, why in the first point in the previous slide, the results were not measured in terms of shareholder value created, but revenues, employment, investments? At least I think it would be fair to measure the results of these managers versus their supposed target, which is shareholder value.
So yeah, I'll talk about that.
Thank you.
So we can only look at stock market value in the US because the Danish sample of publicly listed firms is too small to be able to do that. But in both countries, we look at profits and return on assets, which are not perfect measures of shareholder value, but they're informative about that. Thank you for the question. Okay, so I'm going to look at the publicly listed firms in the United States, the whole universe of publicly listed firms. The reason for that is because we can get biographical information for these firms and therefore can know what education their CEOs have. Business degrees for them are going to be MBAs, business undergraduates, executive MBAs, and so on and so forth. But in the US, it's dominated by MBAs. We're going to match this to the US matched employer-employee data from the Census of Longitudinal Employee and Household Dynamics Program, LEHD, and firm-level data from the longitudinal business data. So this is going to be fairly comprehensive, and we can track workers over time. It's about half of the US population in our sample, and so a lot of millions of workers. The Danish data is similar, starts a little bit later in 1995. In Denmark, we're going to have access to all the firms. So our sample of firms is going to be a little bit smaller, but not as much as you might have expected in Denmark, because we have access to, actually, it's going to be bigger. The sample of workers is going to be a little bit smaller. In Denmark, we can match this to lots of other data, which we're going to use for mechanism explorations, but it also means that we don't need to get outside sources like Vortex for CEOs' education, but we can track the CEO and know their full education history, and I'm going to use that for the selection part later. So the two little differences between Denmark and US, I won't emphasize them too much. In Denmark, many more of the business education is Master of Finance and other masters, and a larger fraction is undergraduates than in the US. So MBAs are a little bit less important in Denmark than in the US, and undergraduates and Master of Finance is a bit more important than in the US. Second, in the US, labor share is going to be labor share divided, wage bill divided by sales, because we cannot compute value added outside of manufacturing, and most of our firms are outside of manufacturing. In Denmark, we can do a better job, so it's labor share divided by value added. But I convert everything to value added terms for comparison later. So here is what's going on with the US MBAs, as I said. So if you look at the share of firms with business degree CEOs, it goes up from 26% to 43%. Many different schools are represented here. But HBS, Wharton, and Stanford account for a very large chunk of it, 33%. More than I would have thought ex ante. I presented this paper in Sloan, and I found out that despite the illustrious history of our business school, there are almost no CEOs from Sloan. So it's a different market. And this is the same as for Denmark. And here it's even more concentrated. Copenhagen Business School, Aarhus, and SDU account for 70% of all business education among the CEOs. So a lot of the estimates I'm going to present are event studies, but still writing it in an equation form is useful. So we're going to look at YIT as outcome variable. BIT is an indicator for whether manager at firm I at time T has a business degree, a bunch of controls, and then, of course, firm fixed effects and time fixed effects. Now, importantly, the control, we're always going to include industry times year fixed effects, state or region times year fixed effect, firm size quintile times year fixed effects. So that means that always the comparison is within a narrow bin of firms. So we're not comparing really large firms to mom and pop stores. And when we look at wages, which is a large part of what I do, we're also going to control for firm times person fixed effects. So there are no selection effects here in terms of perhaps CEOs hire different types of workers. I'm going to look at Colin. He used to work for Procter & Gamble. A new CEO comes, and then I will look at that new CEO's effect on Colin, who continues to work for Procter & Gamble. And of course, I will study the quit likelihood and other things as well as on the side. So most of the estimates I'm going to present are event studies, although there was some IV estimates as well. And to deal with potential biases in event studies with multiple treatments, we're going to use the imputation estimator from Borussia et al., which essentially means that all of the counterfactuals are computed from never treated firms, so firms that never have business managers. All right, so by this point, probably many of you are worrying about the claims I've made and have come up with various reasons why you may not believe what I've told you already. So my job is try to convince you that you should believe me. So to do that, I'm going to talk about 3 important endogeneity concerns that might be at the back of your head already and explain how we deal with them. First of all, there may be other organizational, economic, or financial changes that are implemented at the same time as the CEO. So we're going to deal with that by controlling for a lot of other things and showing that not much changes together with the CEOs. And in fact, you can suspect that's not a major issue from the fact that productivity, employment, exports, etc., don't change with the CEOs. But I'll show you much more on that, or at least mention it since time is short. I might not be able to show all of it. But the more important concern that, well, an equally important concern that might be worrying some of you is that there might be time-varying factors that are correlated with manager transitions. For example, firms might turn to business school managers when they have had some negative shocks to deal with those shocks, or they need to undertake major restructuring, and it might be those time-varying factors that are responsible for depressed wage growth. So to deal with this, we're going to first show you that there are no pre-trends, so the event studies are very clean. Second, that the results are very, very similar when we look at quote-unquote more exogenous separations, retirements, or deaths of CEOs. And then third, we're going to develop an IV strategy, which I'll talk about in a second. Let me not anticipate it too much, but it's about the diffusion of business managers across similar firms. Finally, even if you believe all the results I've presented or I will present, you might worry that this is not the effect of managers going to business schools, but it's a selection of certain types of people, perhaps more willing or more able to reduce wage growth, selecting into MBAs or business schools. So to do that, we're going to use high school records and high school peer groups to develop another IV strategy to show you that this actually seems to be not who goes to MBAs, but what you learn or what you get exposed to MBAs at business schools. All right, without further ado, let me now jump onto the results. But before I do that, let's pause for another second and see if there are other questions. Okay, if there are no other questions, here are
No
the
hands
results.
raised at the moment.
Okay, so here are the results for the US. This is the wage from, we did not disclose. In the US, disclosing things is very complicated and there are limits to what you can disclose. So we did not actually disclose how many people are in the sample, but millions of people. So from millions of US workers, here is the result. Before a manager change to a business school manager happens, there is no trend in wages. After that happens, there is a negative effect that gets larger over time. And within 5 years, we arrive to this number of 6.7%. These standard errors are computed point-wise and 2 standard deviation bands. So actually, they're a little too conservative because what you want to do is jointly test. And when you do that, that's even more significant. But if already you can see that even with these effects are significant, whereas there is nothing that is close to significance before. And here is the same thing for the labor share. So here the labor share decline is 1.8 percentage points. That's over sales. So if you turn that into value-added terms, that's about a 5 percentage point labor share. Now, many people might have expected, and I had flat priors on this, that managers are going to do other things differently as well, perhaps increase output, expand scale, employment, investment. So not much of that seems to happen. So this is output. Again, no pre-trend, but also no post-trend after manager switch. The red one is employment. The blue one is investment. There is not much more investment or any change in employment either. I'll talk some more about additional things in a second. But before I do that, let me show you the Danish results. They're eerily similar. In Denmark, we have pretty good measures of hourly wage and also annual income. So you see that both hourly wage and annual income go down. Annual income goes down by about 4%, and hourly wage about 3%. And this is the labor share, which is a little bit less than in the US, about 2 percentage points, 5 years after the appointment of the manager. In Denmark, as in the US, there are no effects on output. In Denmark, we can also do value added for the reasons I explained. We observe inputs, no change in value added, no change in employment, or no change in investment. So these are the headline results. Before I go into robustness and various ways in which we've dealt or we've tried to deal with the confounding effects, let me stop and see if there are any other questions.
There's a hand from Douglas. If Douglas could be unmuted. Okay. Could Douglas please be unmuted?
I think, Douglas, you have to agree to unmute yourself. We can only allow you to unmute yourself. That's another question as well.
Okay, there's also a question from Fikrat.
Yes. So you hear me, I guess.
Yes.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for this for this study. I wanted to ask, maybe it's a bit still a question, but I might have missed it. Did you also control for the possible dynamics in the market concentration during this period? Because we know that the direct impact of market concentration can affect how managers are chosen, at the same time can affect how profits or investment share or labor share can change in the firm.
Thank you for your question. One thing I should have said is that we exclude, both in Denmark and the US, all firms that are engaged in mergers and acquisitions or are taken over by private equity. So as a result, the most important set of market concentration changing events are not here. Other than that, market shares or concentration might change because a firm grows much faster than the control group, but we're seeing that that's not happening here. So there are really not any changes in market share that are that notable here. So firms are growing very similar to the control group, if you want to think about it that way.
Thank you very much.
Colin, you also had a question.
Yeah, Daron, you mentioned that the top 3 schools, both in the US and then in Denmark, account for a lot of the CEOs. Yeah. Do you have big enough N to look at effects by school? Can you say that there's a difference in the sort of MBA, the sort of managerial style?
So in Denmark, we can do that. In Denmark, we can't do that because it would just be like 3 of them. It's like a comparison of 3 things. In the US, we could do that, but I don't think the census would allow us to disclose any results like this. But what we have, our next project is actually we have acquired the curricula of all business schools. So we're going to digitize them and look at whether different types of courses and instruction styles have an effect. But I perhaps at some point we might be able to disclose some things. But my guess is that the Census Bureau wouldn't let us disclose whether Harvard MBAs are cutting wages more than, say, Chicago MBAs.
Yeah, one would have priors. It would be interesting to see if those were consistent with the data. Thank you.
Yeah, Danish authorities, thanks to them, they've been amazing, and they are very, very easy to work with. US is more bureaucratic, but thanks to them for making these amazing data available to us.
Now Douglas has his hand up.
Okay, Douglas, please.
Douglas, go ahead. Oh, there you go. Oh, you're muted, Douglas. You have. Okay. There you go.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thanks very much for the patience. I had some tech issues, had to disconnect and jump in again. So to the question, thanks very much, Daron, for presenting this very interesting paper. It just exploded on Twitter when it was published. It was very interesting to see that. So my question is, so you mentioned the results are eerily similar, and that was also my first impression, my qualification of the similarity. To what extent is this driven by companies that operate in both markets, like large employers, like, I don't know, Amazon or Unilever, Procter & Gamble, any other kind of very large multinational companies that might be operating, employing in both countries, and thus, in aggregate, leading to the same results, or more or less. Thanks very much for addressing this.
That's a good question. That's a good question. So we haven't exactly explored that, but we've explored several dimensions of heterogeneity, and we don't, except for a few what I'll mention if I have time, we don't find major heterogeneities. One of them that we explored, most of this we have done in Denmark. Some of them we've also done them in the US, but we cannot disclose the results, but the ones for the Denmark are actually in the appendix of the paper. When you do this by size, large firms versus small firms, the results are very similar, but we haven't done foreign affiliate versus not. That's another interesting question. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. So I've already given you the quantitative magnitude.
Daron, before you proceed, there's one more question from the chat. It says, how should we interpret the reduction in wages? Is this an active reduction or not keeping up with the usual wage increases? This is from Orkun.
So very good question, and something I'm going to talk about in a second. But just as a preview, it is not a wage cut. It's not keeping up with wage growth in other control group, but in a very specific way, and that's going to be our exploration into the mechanisms. I'll come back to that. But before I go there, a couple of other things. First, I've given you the quantitative magnitudes, but what it implies, if you take the US numbers, it implies that business school managers, or the increase in business school managers, explains about 20% of the overall decline in labor share and 15% of the decline in wage growth. So these are not trivial numbers. They're not huge, meaning that there's still room left for other explanations, for example, in the labor share for automation or other things. So I'm happy that my other work has not been completely negated by this, but it's not trivial. In Denmark, it's a little bit smaller because the increase in the number of MBAs is a bit smaller. Now, coming back to robustness and confounding effects, many might have come to your mind. So first of all, these results are not driven by a Hawthorne effect. There's no change in wages or labor share when you switch from a non-business manager to a non-business manager. They're also not driven by the higher education of managers. There's no change when you switch from a non-college to a college degree manager. Interestingly, if you look at economics degrees, which we can do in Denmark, but not in the US, economics degrees don't have the same impact. So it's not economic thinking that seems to be, but of course, there could be many other explanations, especially in Denmark, economics is taught in very different ways. Perhaps in the US, economics and business might have more similarity. We cannot answer that question. There are almost no other confounding changes. We've looked at many. Some that you might have worried about. Are there more managers appointed, less white-collar workers, less occupational structure changes? You go from M form to U form, you increase hierarchy, you reduce hierarchy. We look at all of these things, none of them change. There are only two changes that happen. One is that, somewhat related to my earlier work on automation, business school managers purchase more robots, and they also increase debt relative to non-business managers. However, these changes are too small to explain the wage changes. So we use estimates in the literature of the effects, potential effects of these, and in both cases, they account for about 5% of our estimates. So they cannot account for most of what we are finding. There are no other management changes. There are similar effects from younger and older managers. But there is one interesting pattern that I should emphasize in Denmark again. The results are significantly larger, not like day and night, but they are larger for more recent MBAs. So if you got your MBA in the 70s or the 80s, or sorry, business degree, you tend to have a more muted effect on wages than more recent MBA groups. So the more important issue, so these are mostly dealing with the first endogeneity concern that I mentioned. The more important one is the second one that most people would have worried about. What if these firms were already in trouble or were suddenly shocked by something else, and that's why they're getting a business manager? So to do that, we adopt two strategies in addition to the lack of pre-trends, as I mentioned. One is we look at quote unquote exogenous changes. So these are retirements and deaths of CEOs. Again, this is for Denmark. When we do that for Denmark, you see that the results are very, very similar, almost undistinguishable from what I was reporting before. So that's not a panacea against all omitted variables, but it certainly is reassuring. But to make it more reassuring, it would be great to have a source of variation that randomly allocates business managers to some firms. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but we suggest a particular IV strategy. And here is the IV strategy, which is sort of similar to some ideas I explored in some past work in a different context. Many of these types of practices or ideas spread between like objects, like groups. So here we create cells of similar firms as those that are in the same industry, region, and size cell. And what turns out to be the case both in the US and Europe, and Denmark, is that there is a very clear pattern of diffusion. So for example, imagine that, you know, Eric is a firm, represents a firm in the electronics large size, and then I represent a firm that's in electronics but medium size. At the beginning of the sample, both of our cells, other firms like us, don't have managers that have a business degree. And then Eric in his cell is the first one who hires a business manager. Then what you see is that many more firms start following Eric. So there is a pattern of diffusion among these like firms that the number of managers is growing. So here is that relationship as a first stage in a graph. So this is firms that are in cells. Again, cells are region times industry times size quartile. And some of them are actually starting with positive business managers. They already have business managers at the beginning. So there's going to be more like controls, but the business management practices have already diffused in those cells. And these are firms in a cell that did not previously have a business manager and then starts hiring it. And then what you see is that within about 7 years, these cells converge to the average of the control group. So there's a relatively rapid pattern of diffusion. Now, why is this an attractive source for IV, and what's the problem with it? So let me start with why it's an attractive source of variation. So if we use this as the first stage, it's an almost orthogonal source of variation to the one that I've reported so far. So far, I've reported one in which I've conditioned on firm size and region. So I was only comparing Eric, who starts hiring a business manager, to other firms in his cell. This strategy will essentially completely eschew all those comparisons and only compare Eric's cell to other cells. So it's exploiting a source of variation that was completely left aside before and is now leaving something that, well, the thing that was deriving our earlier results. So that's what's nice about it. What's problematic about it, there are two things that are problematic about it. One of them, just we have to take it on the chin. The other one, I'm going to try to spin it as a positive rather than a negative. The one we have to take on the chin is that now the endogeneity goes from the individual firm to the cell level. Perhaps something happens to Eric's cell. Perhaps that whole cell now needs to do restructuring, and that's why they slowly start introducing business management practice. If that's the case, there's nothing we can do, but at least we have zeroed in what the problem is in this case. Remember, that problem couldn't be driving our results earlier on, because our results earlier on were taking out all of those problems. The second is that I'll spin this as a positive, but you could see it as a negative. What's diffusing here is not just business management, but business management related ideas. So as those ideas diffuse, not only more firms might be hiring business managers, but they might be using some of the same practices, or those that had business managers may be using the same practices more intensively. So in that sense, this is a little bit informative about the broader trends in the business world, and we would expect it to be a little bit larger than the OLS, and in fact, that's what we're going to find. Back here. All right. Let me show you the results. Again, we do all sorts of pre-trend tests, etc., and things look clean. And here are the results. No effects on value added from this IV manager. These different columns control for different lags of the wage and value added of the firm. Doesn't make much difference. But there is a negative effect that's about 50% larger than the event study estimates I showed you, and also about just a little bit less than 50% larger for the labor share. For the same thing in Denmark, now these estimates on log revenue are a bit positive, but they're not significant. Here they are negative and small, but the effects on wage and labor share in Denmark are very similar, again, 50% larger than the OLS. So as I said, it's not a panacea, but this IV gives us greater confidence that this isn't like a time-varying selection that's explaining our results. So let me show you two other things, which go back to one of the first questions that I received. Who benefits? Shareholders benefit. Now, in fact, that's not very surprising. You know exactly the productivity doesn't change, employment doesn't change, output doesn't change, exports don't change. So what's going on is that you're producing the same thing, you're employing the same number of workers, but you're paying them less. That's exactly why the labor share declines as well. And the rate of return on assets increases correspondingly, about 3% or so. In the US, and a little bit less in Denmark. Now, in Denmark, as I said, we don't have a large enough sample to look at listed firms, but in the US, our sample is all listed, so we can also look at their market cap, and their log market cap also increases by about 5 percentage points, which is, or 5%, yeah, same thing, which is in line, you know, if you reduce labor costs by 7%, given how much of your value added is labor share, that works out to roughly this number. So that's a reality check. Managers themselves also benefit, both in the US, but the only results in the paper that I'm presenting that are not event studies are these are just cross-sectional comparisons. Why? Because we cannot do event studies, because we don't, for the event study, the firm remains the same, the workers remain the same, the management practices change. We can't do that for the person. So we're just comparing business managers to non-business managers. Okay, I have just about 13 minutes, and I have two very important things to do, but then if there are questions, I'm happy to take them, but then I'll open it up for discussion. So one of them is about what's going on with these wages. Are they being cut? Why? How are they being cut? So we actually started this project with a very specific hypothesis, which is that rent sharing changes, meaning that, you know, labor markets are non-competitive and they have rents for workers and firms. That's, you know, of course, not what we write in most of our models, but that's what I've spent a lot of my career on working, and I firmly believe that. And then the question is, how are these rents shared? You know, in most of our models, we take them as like a Nash bargaining or some parameter, but of course, in reality, there are many factors that determine how these rents are shared. And that's where powerful actors such as MBAs or managers with MBAs or without MBAs could have an impact. And if you believe that for gift exchange efficiency or fairness reasons, you should share the rents, that's a different thing than if you think labor is a cost, then you should just cut as much of it as you can. That's a very different mindset. So that's where we were coming to this in the first place. But to be able to nail that, you really need a clean source of changes in rents. So to do that, we follow work by David Hummels and co-authors and use export demand shocks. So those are nice, because essentially what it is doing is that it's saying nothing about you changes. It's just that more of your product is being demanded, so you get higher prices or you sell more of it to that lucrative market. So your production technology is not changing directly, but you're becoming more, you're generating more revenue, more sales, more profits. Are you going to share some of that? So it's a clean exogenous source. And in particular, we try to make it as clean as possible by comparing what's going on with the demand for the products like the ones that you are exporting in the source countries that, or the destination countries, sorry, that to which you are exporting. So in other words, I'm saying, you know, Colin exports to Germany, I export to China. Chinese demand for widgets doesn't change, but German demand changes. So Colin benefits and I don't benefit. So that's the source of variation we explore. So here are the results in terms of showing that now in this context, business managers and non-business managers are not responding differently to these export demand shocks. So profit per worker increases very similarly in both cases, about 16 to 17%. Value added per worker very similarly. Log exports increase very similarly, about 40%. And log value added increases very similarly by about 25%. But then when you look at what happens is that non-business managers share these rents with an elasticity that's fairly generous, but quite in line with other estimates in the literature on rent sharing. So remember, this was leading to a value added increase of, let me show it again to you, value added increase of about 10%. So what that means is that every 10% increase in value added translates into a 2% higher wage for workers. So that's a decent rent sharing elasticity. But then when you look at business managers, that numbers become zero. And as a result, the labor share declines. So to a first approximation, business managers share none of those benefits that they're generated by the exogenous changes in profit opportunities with their workers. And that's where we suspect the shareholder values and leanness and cut unnecessary costs becomes particularly relevant for business managers or educated with business strategies. Now, going back to the issue of wage cuts, we also distinguish positive export shock and negative export shock. With negative export shock, nobody cuts wages. Even business school managers don't feel entitled to cut wages because they're suddenly doing a little bit less well. But the big difference again occurs when you look at positives. The positive that leads to rent sharing for non-business managers, but into non-rent sharing for business managers. Okay. Then the final thing I want to talk about is selection versus causality. So imagine that despite your beginning questions, I've convinced you so far that all of the estimates I have presented so far are correct and mean what I say they mean. You might still say, fine, that's all correct, but none of this is the effect of business school. It's just that business schools themselves attract a specific type of person who is either more capable of saying no to workers when there are windfall gains, or is not willing or likely or share wages, or is stingy when it comes to wages. So how can we try to resolve this particular selection versus causality margin? So to do that, we use another feature of the Danish data that we actually observe all of their high school records. And we draw on another literature which shows that there are very important peer effects in high schools, that if your peers or role models choose a particular major, you tend to follow them. So in particular, we define an individual's peers as those who are in the same school as in the same GPA quartile. Why? Because, you know, Eric, I know, was in the top quartile of his high school class, and he was not going to be influenced by somebody who was failing, but he may be influenced by somebody who was very successful like him. So that's, again, was what we hypothesize, that's what we find, but it's also in line with what the previous literature finds. And then we take your role models to be those who are in one cohort ahead of you. You could do it 2 cohorts, that's very similar. Once you do 3, the effect dies down. And then we control for within cohort, everything is within cohort comparison. So we control for school times cohort and quartile controls. And then we do a bunch of placebo tests, which I'm not going to go into, and the placebo tests though are supportive of our ideas. So let me just, since time is short and I want to leave enough time for discussion, here is the first stage, so to speak. We have about 1.8 million people in our sample, but many of them are older than our data, so we don't observe them in high school. So about 500,000 of them we observe. So for that 500,000, we can run this regression, and for them we find a very powerful effect of role models. So if more people from your role model group go into a business major, you follow them with a very high coefficient, 0.1. This first two columns control for different types of things for the full sample, and these two columns show the same thing for the smaller sample of people who become managers in our sample, CEOs in our sample. That's about 13,000 people. Then we use this as a first stage, but also worrying for the fact that, of course, going to a business degree changes your likelihood of becoming a manager. So we control for the probability of becoming a manager on the right-hand side from the same prediction of the first stage. But the last three columns, without further ado, show the results. So when you are induced to go and get a business degree because of your peers, the resulting wages of your workers when you do become a manager are about 4 percentage points lower, or yeah, annual wage about 4%, residual wage about 4.5 percentage point, labor share similarly. So these are very similar, just slightly larger than our event study estimates. Hence, there is no evidence that there was much of a selection. All of these estimates that we have presented so far seem to be driven by the fact that you were assigned by these role model or whatever other characteristics into a business school. So it's something that's you are acquiring in the business school environment. Let me summarize and then we can take more questions. So we have documented that managers with business education don't increase productivity, output, or whatever, but they do reduce wages, and they do this because they do not share rents with their workers. There are several literatures we're related to, but since time is short, let me just not get into specific papers, but there's a rent sharing literature. So we are showing something very different from that rent sharing literature by identifying something that changes rent sharing patterns on the side of managers, rather than that most of that literature focuses on profits increase or sources of increase in value added. We contribute to the literature on management styles, but focusing on a very specific aspect in business schools, which hasn't much attracted my attention. And there's an informal sociology literature on business education, which discusses some of these ideas, but doesn't have much evidence on this. So we're also contributing to that literature. I would say that the results suggest that these changes of priorities or beliefs of powerful actors are rather important. I mean, 20% of the decline in the labor share, that's a big number. But there's much to be done. So let me just conclude with that. It's unclear what is it that exactly business schools do. Is it specific course content, something in the air, or networks? Perhaps it's the networks that you form that then influence what you do. So ongoing work on digitizing the corpus of business school courses is going to be hopefully a little bit useful. Business schools might be the tip of the iceberg. Many of these ideas are actually propagated more powerfully by management consulting. So that's another thing one could look at. We don't have such data, but such data could be collected or obtained. And then the question is whether this actually matters, because precisely there are no unions. We don't find any differential effects by unions versus non-unions, but perhaps there could be other things that push against lack of rent sharing. And in 1908, Harvard Business School's first dean defined the mission of the school as teaching people to make a decent profit decently. Well, the question is, what does decently mean? I think that's what we might need to investigate more. Thank you.
Thank you, Daron. we have a number of questions in the Q&A. Perhaps Malesh could read some of those out for discussion.
Me too. So there are two questions from Orkun. I don't know if Orkun would like to raise their hand so we can unmute them, but until then, the first question is, are the results symmetric when switching from business to non-business majors? Do you see that in the data, and does the
great question. I was going to mention that, but I ran out of time. That's a great question. They are completely asymmetric. So there are no results from reversals.
I see.
So now caveats. One is that there are many fewer reversals. But there are also good reasons. Once particular management practices are introduced that reduce rent sharing, probably it's harder to install that. And then once you have a business school manager, probably the next manager might be chosen in line with the same practices, even if they don't have a business school degree, but we don't know exactly.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry. I just tried to fix my microphone in the meantime. So I have one or two more questions, Daron, if you don't mind.
Please
so one thing was, maybe I missed it, but have you looked at the inequality in terms of wages? How does that change within the firm? Is there any effects on that? And because if not, then I'm also wondering why do these employees stay? Do they stay because you don't find much on them total employment in the firm, right? So what's the deal in that dimension?
Great question.
I'm also
yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick another concern maybe about the identification. Since you're using peer networks, I was wondering how concerned we should be about the fact that people also do not exogenously choose their peers. So that whatever characteristics that you're concerned of in terms of making people go into the business education, they're going to be having similar characteristics with their peers, and they're going to affect. So peer effects. I'm not sure if that's solving the problem of characteristics playing a role into going to business education, and should be concerned in that sense in terms of that identification strategy. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me do them in reverse order. So no IV strategy is perfect, so there should definitely be some residual concerns in your mind, but not the ones that you have articulated, because we are using potential peers, not actual peers. So the only selection here is in two dimension. One is that you select into that high school, but in Denmark it's not. It's fairly regimented. So there isn't all that your family is sending you to that high school because they are going to become a particular type of manager. I don't think that's a major issue. And then the second selection is the GPA. But again, I think that's a rather secondary concern. Other than that, everybody in the same GPA category in the previous year is your peer. So it's like a potential peer. So we're not using the fact that you have chosen to be friends with somebody, or you have chosen Eric as your role model and not me, or whatever. So in that sense, I don't think the sort of the standard choice-based selection is an issue. In terms of the inequality and quits, those are excellent questions. Sorry, I did not have time to mention them. So we don't find major effects on inequality. The negative impacts are a little bit, relative negative impacts on wages are a little bit larger for lower skilled workers, but not enough to have a meaningful impact on the skill premium. We do, however, find quits go up, especially for high skill or high productivity workers. But reiterating the fact that, as I was hypothesizing, this is likely, both of these are likely frictional labor markets. That's a very slow process. So quits go up, but slowly enough that you don't even see an impact on employment within 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. But people seem to be unhappy enough that they are quitting somewhat more.
Malesh, are there other Q&A questions to be read?
There are multiple. Let me pick one. So Kemal Osbeck asks, what could be some possible solutions for this problem? Should firms be regulated by demanding them to pay workers by making them shareholders, or something else?
Great questions. I don't know the answer to those, but let me mention two things. One of them is that, I have many former students, many friends and co-authors in business schools, and we've given it in a few businesses. The paper is relatively recent, but we have given it in one or two places. So the reactions that you get is from business school people, yes, this is exactly what we were worried about, versus no, this is exactly what they should be doing. So both of those are encouraging in some sense. But, I would say, business schools are somewhat aware of this. I mean, every business school that I know has introduced an ethics course over the last 2 decades. These courses are introduced because there is a concern among business school leadership, or at least some of the groups that they are accountable to, that somehow they're not teaching the right thing. Now, most of these ethics courses are rather secondary and they may not have a big impact, but it emphasizes perhaps there's something that can be done about the business school environment. Now, that would depend on this question. If it's specific course content, that's easy to fix. If it's something in the air, perhaps Gautam Rao had this paper on the job market. It was a fantastic paper. I love the paper about 10 years ago, where higher caste Indian children act more selfishly when they are just among themselves, and start becoming less selfish more generally when they are exposed to lower caste people. So it may well be that it's something in the air. You're hanging out with other privileged people who are going to become the captains of industry and unimaginably wealthy in the future. Perhaps that makes you just much more selfish. That's one possibility. If that's the case, that's much harder to fix. You can't fix that with course content, but perhaps you can fix it with other ways, like the Indian school reform that mixed low caste and high caste people. So, but there might also be institutional counterweights. But let me not get into them since they would take too long.
I note that we are officially out of time. So at this point, let me thank Daron for a very stimulating paper. I believe that for those who are interested, there will be now an informal period for further discussion where we will—
Let me stop sharing then.
Where we will not record. I personally am going to have to leave at this